Okay, hello. Cool, so Mike and Mike. So Mike and I, we see architecture and the built environment as an act of spatial negotiation. And so this is particularly for us, particularly true with the design and envisioning of learning environments. And so today we're gonna kind of share and present a conception of school that isn't kind of isolated, compartmentalized box located, surrounded by a sea of parking, but an idea of a distributed network as a school. And so, but talking about this idea of how we arrived at this conception of school, there's a number of kind of logical reasons as to why this is the case. But for us, this kind of reality creates an environment of isolation and compartmentalization. So for us, there's a number of reasons why this exists. For us, we're kind of trained as architects, and for us, we're used to the kind of status quo vision of the architect as someone who kind of waits for projects to come to them. We advocate for a kind of model of architecture as a kind of proactive agent, so that the architect is looking beyond kind of defining who the client is, what defines the site, and looking to kind of construct relationships inside and outside of the ostensible project. So at its core, this conception of school for us should represent how students of all ages learn and want to learn. So this is a diagram that kind of distills down how students learn inside and outside of school. So on the left, you have this kind of old-fashioned, indifferent to subjectivity model of education. Outside of school, not school, students are still learning, they're just having fun doing it. So as part of this kind of model and conception of school, we're looking at how do we kind of pull the things that happen outside of school into school, so there isn't this delineation between what happens when you go to school and what happens when you are outside of school. I teach actually study at Lawrence Tech with Professor Orlowski, and along with Mike, we've had this conversation a number of times. And so, in Detroit, there are a number and wide array of resources available to kind of begin to think about how learning can happen outside of school and the kind of informal pedagogies that exist as part of this potential network. So, in this kind of categorization, we've begun to think of kind of groups that kind of form kind of a think tank. So Detroit Future Schools and the Build Institute. These are groups that are looking at kind of new pedagogical ideas that exist outside of the classroom. Detroit has a very strong maker culture. It's rooted in its history and ethos. So you have here Mount Elliott Makerspace, which exists within a church, and it's less of a high-end fabrication space and more of an environment to provide resources to a community in need. So Mount Elliott was also part of this program called HYPE that's in the Detroit Public Library. And so this is a project actually by Joe Styczynski that expands the kind of thinking of a makerspace in a library. So this is the Detroit Public Library. This is one of the most iconic spaces of the library. It says there's art on the wall. It says precious, do not touch. But the project really thinks about how make culture can be infiltrated into the library. This is Arts and Scraps. Arts and Scraps is this kind of incredible vision to kind of source discarded materials and reframe their value around kind of constructing art and using art as a kind of project-based learning exercise. And so Arts and Scraps, in many ways, for us, kind of embodies this vision, this idea that you can have a physical location, but you can be directly connected to the entire city itself. So Arts and Scraps has a fleet of vans that grabs these materials, sources them, and then brings them back to a kind of physical location, or also takes them to a kind of classroom environment as well. So they have a kind of direct manifestation of that connection. This is the Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers. This is run by a woman named Saturi Shakur. And so this is a network and a group that is imagined and designed to kind of capture and convey personal narratives and stories as a means of kind of self and collective expression.
So a few years ago, we invited Greg Green to our office to talk about his experience as a principal of a local high school. At that time, when school funding was being cut and resources were going away, he found that this lack of resources really lent itself to a creative solution. So Greg introduced a blended learning environment that kept students active, engaged, and empowered. Now that we've identified several atypical methods of learning environments that are deeply rooted in the urban fabric, what does this mean for the future of educational facilities? Is there a way to successfully scale up these models to that of the city So instead of looking at the traditional model, looking at this kind of zoomed out model, traditionally we build schools that are virtually autonomous entities within their own autonomous community with their own food service, gyms, auditoriums, libraries, etc. We feel that schools could leverage and strengthen community relationships by not building more of the same existing resources. Instead, we need to find ways to leverage what is already available in our backyards. As a reciprocal act, schools could provide much needed community-focused resources that don't already exist in these communities, such as incubation spaces, maker spaces, laboratories, support groups, and clinics. This model encourages students and public, there we go. So essentially there's a diagram that illustrates how we're sampling from the city, and so we developed this case study that leverages the people mover in the M1 to connect students to these world-class institutions, providing for a public education center that's second to none. So I guess in closing, and this is your homework, we're asking you to answer the following questions. How can we enable all students of all social and economic backgrounds? How can we deconstruct borders and divisions? Where are we going? How do we get there? And what is the role of the architect in fostering critical educational environments today?